So the topic I want to talk about today on ideological diversity on university campuses, particularly thinking about university faculty on college campuses, does come out of the Speak Freely book and the kinds of conversations I had with people about that book over time. As you may know, the book tries to mount a defense about why we ought to have relatively robust protections for free speech on universities. It tries to ground that in thinking about what the point of a university is in the first place, which, as I understand it, is really a truth-seeking mission of universities. Universities are trying to explore difficult and controversial ideas and trying to develop correct answers to hard questions. And that requires space in order to develop those controversial ideas, to think about those difficult questions, to follow evidence and arguments wherever they might lead. And partially the book tries to develop a Millian argument about why it is that having greater diversity on campus is helpful for thinking through ideas. That's sort of pitched in terms of generally thinking about free speech broadly on campus. The book ends with a bit of a pitch about the importance, particularly of political diversity, ideological diversity on college campuses. And I thought that particular issue of ideological diversity is worth coming back to a bit and trying to explore in a little bit more detail. And so this talk really tries to just walk through 4 questions thinking about ideological political diversity among university faculty. And part of my starting point for really thinking about this topic and needing to talk about it more explicitly and directly is how often I encounter colleagues, both at my institution, but certainly at other institutions as well, who simply don't believe that universities are not already politically and ideologically diverse, that they are convinced that there, in fact, are lots of conservatives and Republicans among university faculty. To the extent that there are not more of them, it's certainly not a problem, poses no particular difficulties for how academia operates and how universities work. Maybe it's a virtue that, in fact, there aren't more of them on university campuses more generally. This strikes me, at least the first claim, that sort of the factual matter, how diverse are university faculty from a political perspective, strikes me as a lot of people burying their heads in the sand and thinking about this issue. It strikes me as obviously the case that university faculty are quite tilted. But it is striking how often, I think, if you talk to university faculty, they are willing to deny that reality. So I think it's worth trying to think through, well, what's the evidence that we have on this front, and what does the landscape actually look like. After talking a little bit then about sort of what are the facts, is it actually true that there's not a lot of ideological diversity among university faculty, at least in the United States? And I should say I'm mostly limiting myself to thinking about the United States, not necessarily thinking about other countries. I have no reason to think other countries are particularly different, but the evidence that we have, at least about the political beliefs of university faculty have mostly been restricted to studies of the United States. And so we just don't have a lot of data on what faculty look like in other places. And so I'm mostly going to focus, at least in that part, and thinking about, is it true that universities are fairly homogeneous politically in the American context? I want to think a little bit then about why might that be true? Why is it the case that there are so few conservatives on college campuses? And then think some about does it matter and what should be done about it. The does it matter question, I think, is actually an interesting one, and in some ways the starting point really for thinking about this talk more generally. Cass Sunstein, who is a liberal law professor, at one point talked about as a possible Supreme Court justice under a Democratic administration. Now he's probably not far enough to the left to get such a nomination these days, as well as being potentially a little too old at this stage of the game. But Sunstein published a piece in Bloomberg Opinion several months ago now, in which, in keeping with other work that Sunstein's interested in, and thinking about echo chambers and how deliberation occurs in various kinds of intellectual environments, wrote a brief piece arguing that there aren't enough conservatives in university faculty, and that this is bad for academia and how it operates intellectually. These struck me as obvious points to make. Sunstein wasn't breaking any new ground. I doubt he thought he was breaking any particular new ground in stating it. It struck me as mostly uncontroversial, the kinds of claims he said. What I was struck by was the reaction to Sunstein's piece. And so he was immediately swamped by comments, and I was particularly struck by comments among fellow political scientists thinking about this in particular, in which they said, well, we're scientists, and so it doesn't matter what the political beliefs are of a political scientist, because we're all just running regression analyses anyway, and so who cares whether there are any Republicans, because I can teach you statistics in the exact same way whether I'm a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative. Sunstein just doesn't understand how the social sciences work, or academia more generally works. Otherwise, he would recognize this isn't a problem in general. And this struck me as stupid, but starting to puzzle out why this is a bad argument in response to Sunstein did strike me as quite interesting, because it's not immediately obvious, I think, why we ought to care very much about political diversity. So as I said in the Speak Freely book, I try to develop an argument sort of based on John Stuart Mill that intellectual diversity is a good thing to have in universities. And one of the striking things in thinking about Mill's argument in a university context is what the limits to that are. So Mill says, look, you really want to hear from the gadfly, the dissenter, the person who's out in the wings. You want to bring their arguments in and really listen to people who seriously believe those arguments. And that leads in a university context to start asking questions like, well, is it really the case that you need the Bigfoot expert in the biology department? Do you really need the young Earth theorist? Do you need the flat Earth believer in the geology department and the like? Universities are precisely about excluding those kinds of people from the faculty. So there are some limits, and we have some rationales for why we try to impose some limits on how faculty are constructed in universities and what the limitations of intellectual diversity are. We aren't specifically, at least theoretically, trying to exclude Republicans and conservatives from university faculty the way we are trying to exclude flat Earth theorists from geology faculty. But there is an interesting question about why might it matter if we don't have that particular kind of intellectual diversity on a college campus? Does it really make a difference for how political scientists do their work, for example, if there are no conservatives in the discipline? And so trying to think through those issues, I think, is ultimately important as we try to think about the consequences of homogeneity in university faculty. But before we get to consequences, it's worth thinking about the extent to which this is true. So I don't know if you find these sort of denials about whether or not university faculty are already politically diverse, particularly compelling or not. Certainly it doesn't ring true from my own personal experience in academia more generally. And of course, this started early, and this becomes relevant, I think, for when we think some about why it's true of university faculty. I wrote for a conservative newspaper when I was in college and as an undergraduate, in which case we had to sue our university to allow us to distribute newspapers on college campus, because the university tried to formally block us from doing so. When we did start distributing newspapers on campus, they were routinely destroyed and stolen by activists on the left. When we stopped then leaving them out and started handing them out individually, we were spit at and called names in trying to hand out these papers. Academia, from that perspective, looks like a relatively hostile environment for conservatives. And this was at the University of Texas in the 1980s, so not exactly the place where you would think conservatives were not well represented. And of course, there were lots of conservative students on campus more generally, but the environment, the intellectual environment being created on university campuses is not necessarily a welcoming one. Things certainly didn't get better when I was in grad school or on university faculties. And at one point, my wife, who was a graduate student in political science at a different university, than mine, not yet. My wife at that point mentioned to her friends she was dating this guy who's a conservative. And I could have warned her that this was not a thing you should say unless you know who it is you're talking to. She was not prepared for the response. And one thing I point out to her afterwards was, well, look, in the future, if you ever find yourself needing to say something like this, never say that I'm a conservative. You should always say I'm a libertarian, because at least that's better than a conservative, and that tends to be true in academic circles. The libertarians meld much more easily into an academic environment. They were meted with much less hostility in an academic environment, which is not to say no hostility, but less hostility. That might be true, for example, my colleague Robert George, who is a Catholic social conservative, very visible natural law theorist, visible public intellectual as a conservative Catholic. He meets a great deal of hostility in academic circles, and the numbers of people who have the kinds of beliefs he does is a very small number in academia, much smaller than, for example, libertarians on university campuses. But that's all anecdotal, right? So that's my impression. Obviously, I encounter other people who have a different impression about just how many conservatives there happen to be on college campuses. Fortunately, there is, in fact, some data on these issues. Social scientists have tried to study what the political orientation of university faculty are, and they've been trying to do these studies since the mid-20th century. So really since the 1950s, there's been sort of systematic efforts to try to think about what the issue commitments are of university faculty, what the larger ideological commitments are of university faculty, what the voting behavior is of university faculty. And across a wide range of studies, using different kinds of methods to try to capture this idea, starting in the 1950s and into the 1960s, one of the very initial prominent findings of these studies is academia overwhelmingly leans to the left. That they overwhelmingly vote Democratic. They vote Democratic in much greater proportions than the general population. They held issue positions that were far to the left of most Americans, and moreover, they held issue positions that were far to the left of most other college-educated Americans, more generally. As one of these studies summarized, looking at the evidence from the 1950s and early 1960s, at that point, American university faculty were the most left-wing occupational group in America, right? More liberal than any other group and any other professional group in the United States were university faculties. Nonetheless, as these studies expanded in the 1960s, for example, they discovered there are, in fact, some Republicans. Some people who were willing to vote Republican, some actual conservatives in university faculty in the 1950s and 1960s. They were not randomly distributed. They all happened to be in the engineering schools, which is not quite entirely correct, but largely correct. So, for example, one study that looked at voting behavior and focused on how you cast your vote, and this is during the period when people were making decisions about whether or not to vote for Dwight Eisenhower, as well as later deciding whether or not to vote, for example, for John F. Kennedy. Political scientists lean Democratic at a rate of roughly 75%, which was consistent with the social sciences and humanities more generally, that the numbers of how far leaning university faculty were in their voting behavior was on the order of 3/4 of the faculty leaned Democratic. By contrast, 3/4 of the engineering faculty on university campuses leaned Republican at this point. And the civil engineering faculty were the extremes in this regard. So engineering was different than the natural sciences, for example. And natural sciences tend to be much mixed. Engineering was by far the most conservative, Republican-leaning profession in these studies in the 1950s and 1960s. And they tend to share, to some degree, that valence of being more Republican-leaning with, for example, business school faculty, with other vocational-oriented faculty. So, for example, agricultural sciences faculty tended to be Republican-leaning during this period. Mining faculty tended to be Republican during this period, but not the natural sciences, not the arts and sciences, not the law schools, et cetera. Those are all very much Democratic-leaning. Moreover, people ask these questions. trying to get at people's particular issue positions. So how did they view different kinds of positions, and how did that compare to American society more generally? And then social scientists often ask these kinds of questions and then scale them on sort of standard, sort of liberal versus conservative kind of scaling. And the results are exactly the same. That is, you get very similar kinds of results if you actually ask people questions, not about who did you vote for, which party do you identify with, but if you ask them questions about what's your view on this set of issues, and then let's tally up how people view those issues in general. So academia overwhelmingly leaning toward the left, but with Republicans to some degree found in some parts of academia. And notably, it's not only sort of engineering and certain fields of study, but it's also true that you could find more Republican faculty in less prestigious institutions. And so these studies, to the extent that they were, and there were some very nice studies being done during this period that had very large sample sizes, and so it's possible to distinguish between different kinds of institutions. And one thing they tended to find was you found more Republicans and more conservatives at low prestige, teaching-oriented institutions, whereas elite, research-oriented, or even elite liberal arts colleges leaned far more to the left than was generally true. So there's been a set of studies since then that tries to update this information from the 1980s, but in particular in the 1990s. And more recently, there's been a number of studies that, again, tried to use a variety of different measures to try to test out how university faculty are oriented, politically speaking. And to some degree, they reinforce those earlier findings from the 1950s and 60s, and to some degree, they modify them. So, for example, one study done of California voter registration, so looking at universities specifically in California, where you had to vote, register to vote with a particular party, and as a consequence, you get a voter ID from public information about how people registered to vote. The social sciences were nearly 90%. Democratic registering, and this included, and of course, I mean, I think about this currently in California to think, well, of course, everybody's a Democrat in California, so no surprise that if you wanted to participate in politics, vote for a meaningful election, you might choose specifically to register with the Democratic Party. But that was much less true in the early 90s when this study was being done, and moreover, much less true in the particular communities these universities are built in. So one of the nice things about that study was to compare those voter registration rates among university faculty with people in the surrounding county and city. And so not only did people, how do people register to vote in California broadly, but moreover specifically in those areas, how are people registering to vote? And university faculty were far more democratic than their neighbors were even in California. What's also striking, though, about that study is while it found social sciences are now something like 90% leaning Democratic, it also found that engineering was leaning Democratic at roughly a 70% rate. Right? So you had this massive shift where you used to be able to find Republicans in the business schools and engineering and the like. These more recent studies from the 1990s, looking at voter registration and other things, tend to find that to be much less true. And again, you can replicate those kinds of studies by looking at other kinds of measures. So if you ask people who they voted for as opposed to actually looking at their voter registration records, if you ask people, again, about their issue positions on various things and then try to scale that, all those things tend to suggest that university faculty lean heavily to the left, and moreover, they lean heavily to the left across the board in ways that was not true in the 1950s and 1960s, such that it is often the case, for example, that university faculty now will tell me, well, of course there are no Republicans in my discipline. I don't actually know any Republicans on the campus, but I'm sure there must be some conservatives over somewhere else on the campus, probably over in the business school or something. And as we've studied the business schools and engineering schools in the 1990s and 2000s, we've increasingly found that there aren't very many conservatives and Republicans there either. That it was once the case that you could find Republican and conservative faculty in the engineering schools and the business schools, but that's just not as true anymore. It's also notably true even at less prestigious institutions. You can't find conservatives and Republicans, so they've been driven out even of those institutions as well. The one place, the one kind of institution where you can still find in some significant numbers conservative academics is in primarily religious institutions. and not Catholic institutions, primarily Protestant religious institutions. So specifically for Protestant-affiliated colleges tend to actually have a sizable number, not a majority by a long shot, but a sizable number of Republican and conservative-leaning faculty on staff. It's also true that very recently there's been some very nice studies, primarily focusing on law professors, in particular looking at campaign donations. So when faculty put their money where their mouth is and actually try to give money to individual candidates, who are they giving money to? There are various ways you can look at this, but including you can try to scale that, so try to create a matrix in which you look at, given a range of donations people are making, what does that suggest about where their ideology lies compared to other donors who are also making a range of donations to a range of candidates. And those findings in law schools are very comparable to what you find using other measures and looking at other kinds of faculty, including law school faculty based on voting and the like as well. So for example, one recent study found that only 15% of law professors who give campaign donations scaled as largely conservative in their choices about who they give campaign donations to. 85% of law professors are giving money primarily to more left-leaning candidates of one sort or another. And interestingly, this too is not randomly distributed. That is, again, lower ranking law schools tend to have more of the conservative donating law professors in them, and fields of study within law schools are also not randomly distributed. That is to say, to the extent you can find some conservative leaning law professors, they don't write about public law issues. They don't write about administrative law. They don't write about constitutional law. They write about issues where their politics are largely behind the scenes. So they write about tax law, for example. So you can find some conservative-leaning law professors, but you can't see it very easily in their scholarship because if they're writing about it in their scholarship, oddly enough, they don't become law professors. So I think all the evidence across a whole range of measures, looking at a whole bunch of different institutions across a range of time, all demonstrate that university faculty in the United States lean left. They've leaned left since at least the mid-20th century, probably long before, and they've only leaned more to the left over time as there are fewer and fewer conservatives and Republicans to be found in academia over time. So why might this be true? And of course, one answer is because conservatives are too stupid to be professors. And in fact, a lot of faculty will tell you this is the correct answer. As to why there are no conservative faculty, or not very many conservative faculty, because they just can't cut it. They aren't smart enough to be university professors. Or alternatively, the conservative mindset is inconsistent with the approach to academic study that is necessary to be successful. So conservatives may not be stupid per se, but they can't, for example, accept the scientific method. And as a consequence, can't become good scientists. There's very little evidence that any of those things are actually true about conservatives or about why it is that conservatives don't find themselves in academia. So is there some evidence about why conservatives don't find themselves in academia very much? One answer clearly is self-selection. That is, conservatives choose not to go into academia. So it's clearly the case there are lots of conservative undergraduate students, for example, but those undergraduate students who are conservative very quickly start segregating themselves out such that they indicate that they have no particular interest in pursuing an academic career, unlike left-wing undergraduates who are much more likely to say they want to go to grad school, they want to pursue an academic career in the long term, such that the pipeline that might lead you to a job in the faculty is already pretty thin, even at the undergraduate level, and even very early on at the undergraduate level, where conservative students are already indicating by their freshman, sophomore year that they have no particular interest in continuing in academia in the long term in ways that's not so true of their more left-leaning undergraduates more generally. So for whatever reason, and there are various explanations being offered for why this might be true, but for whatever reason, conservatives choose not to pursue an academic career more generally. It's also the case the universities are perceived by lots of conservative students as being a hostile environment. for them, that they recognize that they are on the margins of academia. They recognize that their views are not welcome in academia more generally, and so they view this as not a very attractive thing to pursue across your career. So for example, there's some evidence that suggests that students who are particularly interested in politics, for example, if they are left-leaning students who have particular interest in politics, they might well be social science majors. They might be political science majors. For example, conservative students with an interest in politics avoid the social sciences like the plague, and instead constrain themselves to engaging in activism, extracurricular activities relating to their interest in politics, but they avoid studying it in academia more generally because they're avoiding those professors and that subject matter more generally. And again, there's some evidence to suggest that they're avoiding it because they think that their faculty are likely to be hostile to them, and so they prefer not to pursue it. Even more disturbing is there some evidence of active discrimination. So strikingly, there's been a handful of studies that have simply asked faculty on anonymous surveys if you knew that a particular graduate student applicant, for example, or applicant to be hired to your faculty, or somebody who might be invited to your conference was a conservative, would you be less likely to allow them admission into your graduate program, allow them to be hired to your faculty, or allow them to be invited to your conference or program? And across a range of disciplines, the answer is nearly a third of faculty say they're less likely to allow a conservative to be invited into those kinds of environments more generally. And moreover, if you ask them not what would they personally do, but what do they think their colleagues would do, the number is even much higher. So there's a much larger set of people who think, while I personally would not discriminate against conservatives, certainly my colleagues would discriminate against conservatives, right? Which suggests then that there's a lot of perception on university faculty that actual discrimination is not uncommon. Since there are hardly anybody in the pipeline, there aren't very many opportunities to actually be able to act on that kind of discriminatory intent, but it is a disturbing feature of current academia that there is this sort of willingness to express a desire to discriminate based on politics and ideology. So does any of that matter? So there are hardly any conservatives in academia. There are fewer all the time. Does it make any difference? Well, one kind of thing where we might worry that it might make a difference is something that gets a lot of public attention, which is the idea that faculty are primarily indoctrinating their students. And so if you think that what university education is primarily an indoctrination camp, then it should be disturbing if all the indoctrination is occurring from one side. Maybe you think left-leaning faculty are particularly likely to engage in indoctrination, so it'd be particularly disturbing if you have this unbalanced faculty more generally. The evidence for that is quite thin, though. If you ask students, for example, their perception of what happens in classes, what they receive in classes, whether they think they're being graded fairly in classes, for example, students on these large surveys give very little reason to think that there's much perception of actual indoctrination going on. Students certainly worry that they might encounter indoctrination at some point, but when you actually ask them what their actual experiences have been, there's relatively little evidence of indoctrination per se. So we might not need to worry too much about left-leaning faculty given that kind of concern, but I think we still ought to worry about what a left-leaning faculty means for the core thing that universities are fundamentally about, which is their ability to explore difficult and controversial ideas and try to advance toward the truth. So why might this be a concern? We might think, for example, it doesn't matter very much whether people are conservatives or liberals for lots of academic questions that people ask. There's all kinds of intellectual diversity in a university environment or even a particular disciplinary environment that we might care about. So as we think about the kind of divisions that exist within university faculty, and for example, specifically in the discipline of political science, or even in one neck of the woods in political science, such as the study of American politics, all kinds of differences about methodology, how you ought to go about studying these phenomena, all kinds of differences about substantive theories and traditions and research agendas, about what those ought to look like and how we ought to divide. And university faculty fight about that stuff all the time, don't invite people to each other's conferences, don't want to hire people, et cetera, based on that kind of intellectual diversity. And we might think that kind of intellectual diversity is the intellectual diversity we ought to care about the most, right? It's that those differences based on how do you go about studying political phenomenon? What's the theories you're bringing to bear to study those issues are the things that are most closely tied to the actual pursuit of the substantive scholarly questions that academics are pursuing. And so we ought to worry about that kind of diversity. Maybe we don't need to worry so much about political diversity as such. But I think that would be a mistake to not worry about political diversity at all and think it's largely irrelevant to the educational enterprise. And surely the answer is still going to be the case, however, that how much it varies is going to depend some on the disciplines we're talking about. So it may well be the case that it matters less how ideologically diverse chemistry professors are. And it may matter much more how ideologically diverse law professors are, for example. So I think we ought to find it disturbing, given the nature of law and how what law professors do and what the legal academic profession looks like and how it pursues scholarship. It ought to be disturbing if we find that 85% of law professors are left-leaning and only a small fraction are right-leaning. And then we, in fact, are losing something that's directly relevant to what the academic scholarly argument itself might look like. But maybe that's less true when we're talking about sociology or political science or history, let alone if we're talking about biology or chemistry, for example. But I think there's some reasons to be concerned even in those kinds of disciplines as well. One is simply loss of talent. That is to say, if you put up a big sign saying conservatives need not apply to academia, you're cutting yourself off from a whole stream of particularly intellectually talented individuals who might otherwise come into academia and be quite useful. That might not matter very much if every individual who enters academia is basically the same, because certainly it's the case we produce a lot of PhDs, more PhDs than we actually need to fill academic positions. There are PhDs who are desperate to get academic positions. They can't find them because we're, in fact, producing too many PhDs. And so as a consequence, we might think, well, look, some loss of talent is fine. If we hang out a big sign saying no conservatives need to apply, and as a consequence, we shrink the potential pool of PhDs and potential academics, no problem, because we're still able to fill our ranks with plenty of existing PhDs without worrying about whatever lost talent from conservatives going off and doing something else instead of going into academia. And that might be true, I think, if scholars were completely exchangeable for one another. There's no difference between different kinds of academics, but that simply, I think, is not true. The academic enterprise, the intellectual enterprise, is a highly individual enterprise, and part of what you're losing in terms of talent is losing things that are tied to specific individuals. In that sense, you want to cast your net as wide as possible, bring as many people into academia as possible, have a variety of individual insights into the human condition that they might be able to exploit. And to the extent that you're artificially cutting that off and preventing a set of people from entering into academia, you're losing insights, you're losing teaching skills that you otherwise might have gained in academia, and that's a genuine loss. I think even if it's possible to actually fill all the jobs and have enough people actually be in the classroom giving lectures, we're nonetheless losing something by having lost some talent. Secondly, I think we're also in a difficult bind in terms of mentoring and teaching in academia. Part of what we're trying to do in universities is not only do the scholarly research, but we're also trying to engage in teaching. We're trying to mentor young students and the like. And if the faculty are overwhelmingly leaning to the left, then that means that there's a whole set of students who are not going to find good mentors on campus, who are not going to find connections to be built on campus. The same rationales that lead us to worry about diversity in other contexts in terms of academic employment, or whether we're worried about gender diversity or we're worried about racial diversity or other concerns on college campuses, precisely because part of what we're worried about is the connection that faculty can make to their students. Then we ought to be equally concerned about those kinds of gaps as they exist in terms of political and ideological diversity. If students look at the faculty and think, this person doesn't think any of the same things I think, this person doesn't have any of the values that I value, and as a consequence, it's not worth talking to that person, I can't learn anything from that person, I shouldn't connect with that person, then partially we're not doing our jobs very well. They have consequences in the long terms in terms of our ability to mentor and produce good students who can go off and be good citizens more generally, but also has very immediate concerns on a college campus itself. It means, for example, that conservative students who are politically engaged and active on college campuses tend to find themselves without any faculty advisors, without people they can talk to and get advice from about what they're doing on college campuses. They're much more on their own. And as a consequence, we shouldn't be too surprised if part of their actions that emerge out of that is more juvenile and adolescent sophomoric than it might otherwise be. There's value in having adults who can supervise and advise and mentor young conservatives on college campuses. And if you don't have those people on the faculty, you certainly don't have them among university administrators, then you're leaving those students much more on their own on college campuses itself beyond what they're doing and preparing for their larger careers. And as a consequence, they're doing a disservice, I think, to those students by not having more people around who can connect with them in a wider variety of ways. But even from the scholarly side of things, in terms of actually doing the research that we're concerned with in academia, I think we also ought to worry about what ideological homogeneity means for our ability to engage in creative thinking about the issues that concern us. So it may well be that it doesn't matter whether you're conservative or a liberal in terms of your ability to learn statistics and run a regression analysis and interpret the results, right? That may well be true whether you're a conservative or Democrat, a Republican-leaning or a Democratic-leaning conservative or a liberal more generally. What you do lose out on, though, is not your ability to run a regression or code data or interpret regression results. What you lose out on is agenda setting. You lose out on what kinds of questions do people want to ask in the research? What do you want to collect data on? What questions do you want to ask of that data? What kind of regressions do you want to run? Because what hypotheses are you going to test? And those questions you want to ask are, in fact, intimately connected with what people normatively value. What do they care about? And as a consequence, you would not get people who says, well, it doesn't matter because we're all scientists here, we're just doing political science, and so it doesn't matter if we don't have any women in political science. We can be 100% male and we'd be doing exactly the same thing because all we're doing is coding data and interpreting regression results. And we all think that would be dumb as an answer to why it'd be okay if there are no women in political science. And part of the rationale for why it's dumb is not because women are better at coding data or running regressions, and so you need some of them in the room in order to do that work more effectively, but because women will ask different questions. They will pursue a different research agenda. They will think about things in a different way, and as a consequence, that will lead you to lines of inquiry you otherwise would have ignored and you wouldn't have pursued at all. And that's the same is true for conservatives and Republican-leaning faculty as well. That if you get conservatives in the room, if you get them into sociology, they will ask different questions about the issues that are of a concern to sociology. They will deploy the methods of sociology differently than their more left-leaning faculty. And as a consequence, we will learn new things that we otherwise wouldn't learn because people are asking those questions in an academically rigorous way that's fully consistent with our scholarly expectations, but they will be approaching those issues from a different angle. And we should be welcoming people into the room who are going to approach issues from a different angle. Secondly, we should also worry, I think, that people are going to be too credulous about certain kinds of results. So if you have all left-leaning faculty in the room and you're pursuing questions that are normatively politically freighted, for example, people tend not to ask hard questions if it turns out that the answers you're getting are largely aligned with and sympathetic to your ideological priors. If you have certain expectations about how the world works and people are producing studies that reinforce those expectations, it's much easier to simply accept those results at face value and assume they must be true. If, on the other hand, people are giving you counterintuitive results, they're giving you results that don't seem to map onto how you think the world actually works in practice, you tend to push much harder. You really want people to then show you, to demonstrate to you that they did that right, that they're getting this counterintuitive answer for the right reasons, because you have prior reasons for being skeptical of the kinds of answers they're giving you. And everybody's thinking the same way. That means some kinds of research is going to be accepted without a lot of skepticism, and other kinds of research is going to get extraordinary skepticism on the page. And you want much more mix of people in the room then to receive that scholarly research from a variety of perspectives so they can raise questions from a variety of perspectives. They can probe and push on that research from a variety of perspectives rather than simply shrugging their shoulders and say, yeah, that sounds right to me. Because, of course, that's what I thought going in. Right, which is what happens far too often in the social sciences now on a wide range of topics, precisely because there are things that we accept as being likely to be true, and therefore we don't question them very hard when people present evidence that they might be true. So we think it might matter that we don't have a lot of political diversity on college campuses, and in fact, we don't have a lot of political diversity on campus. What should we do about it? And what can we do about it more generally? And it would be easier, actually, if there was more of a pipeline of conservatives. So we discovered, for example, that lots of conservative undergraduates had interest in pursuing academic careers. They were applying to grad school, but they were being turned down at the graduate admission stage. Or there were lots of conservative graduate students, and they were trying to get jobs in academia, but they were getting rejected at the faculty hiring stage. It would be challenging, but it'd be easier to know what to do with it, at least. You know where to focus your attention and trying to target those things in order to make sure that pipeline works more smoothly and people aren't being filtered out at those extremes. But in fact, that's not the situation we face. Instead, we face a situation in which there are no conservative faculty, there are no conservative grad students, and the conservative undergraduates don't want to become grad students and don't want to become faculty. That makes it very challenging as to how do we then draw more conservatives into academia in general. And I think it suggests, for example, that one kind of response that some have suggested, which is a kind of affirmative action for political diversity, is probably misguided. Right? There aren't enough conservatives around to think that you can draw them in, and through some kind of method of affirmative action, you will be able to more effectively recruit them, you will more effectively hire them, you will more effectively represent them on workshops. We're past the stage at which those kinds of efforts in this sort of firm sense of firm quotas, for example, are going to do much good. Those early ideas about affirmative action is primarily being about one of outreach and recruitment and emphasizing that you want to be inclusive and welcoming may well be effective over time, and certainly is something that we ought to be doing. And moreover, we ought to think more self-consciously about how to do it. How do we make conservative undergraduates, for example, imagine that an academic career might in fact be a reasonable thing for them to pursue? It might be something that they could do, would be interesting to do, would be worth doing, and they would ultimately be welcomed in doing, rather than be driven out if they try to do it in general. I think also the kind of answer thinking about as policy solutions go, trying to think about affirmative action for conservative faculty, also invites this very troubling problem of it requires that you actually then identify who the conservatives are and identify others as well, which has a real difficult feature of how do you implement that in academia more generally. Is certainly the case now that some of our faculty, and certainly in some disciplines, it's relatively easy to tell what their political leanings are because it's right there on the surface. It's on the surface of their work, it's on the surface of their research, it's on the surface of their teaching, not hard to figure out. In lots of other contexts, that's not true. Right? You simply don't know necessarily what the political values or concerns are of the people around you in graduate school or university environments. But in order to adopt some kind of affirmative action program, you would require people to start revealing what their underlying political preferences are. People would have to start reporting on forms who they voted for as they were applying for academic jobs, what their self-identification was politically and ideologically as they were applying to graduate school and for university faculty. And in general, I don't think that's a road we want to go down, and moreover would likely have negative rather than positive consequences for conservatives on the whole. So I think we're in a situation where we have a very ideologically homogeneous university faculty in the United States. I think it is problematic and troubling for what it means for how we engage in our core vocational concerns of teaching and research. But I don't think there are any good answers as to how we fix this problem moving forward. The starting point, at least, is to recognize that we have a problem. And unfortunately, a lot of my colleagues, I think, do not recognize that we have a problem. And to the extent that they might recognize the facts on the ground, they may think those facts are good things rather than bad things and problematics. And finally, I should note, just in closing, I think the ultimate consequences, which some academics have worried about actually for quite some time, but they're worrying about it again now, which is there will likely be political consequences to the perception of there being a partisan academy. So if voters and politicians think that universities are overwhelmingly left-leaning institutions and faculty are engaged in left-leaning activities, as increasingly voters and politicians currently think, they will feel no investment in maintaining and preserving those institutions. Instead, they will feel more and more of a need to tear them down and defund them. They are hostile political institutions, and as a consequence, why should you tolerate and support them? Why instead shouldn't you try defund and cripple them to the extent that you can? And I think increasingly conservatives and Republicans are coming around to that view, that they would be better off crippling universities rather than trying to support universities, because universities are in fact political actors, and they are political actors on the wrong side of politics from their perspective. I think it's crucial as a consequence for the future health of universities that they not be perceived as primarily partisan institutions. They not be perceived as political actors engaged in a political game, and as a consequence, it's fair game to treat them like political actors. But that requires the academy to actually behave a little differently than it's behaving now. That requires, in part, the university faculty change their own look, but also requires, in part, that some university faculty start behaving differently than they actually tend to behave. So I'm not necessarily very optimistic about where we are in universities and where that means we are politically with universities. But as I said, I think at least the starting point is to recognize we have a problem and identifying what the contours of that problem are. And then we can start thinking some about solutions. So thank you.